Listen here, child, and pull your chair close to this old fire, 'cause what I'm fixin' to tell you ain't no bedtime story. This here's about a girl named Ava, and Lord have mercy on my soul for the pain I gotta speak into this night air. Ava came across that bitter water in the belly of a slave ship, pressed tight against bodies that was dyin' slow, breathin' air thick as molasses and twice as poisonous. The old ones say that ship was called Deliverance. Ain't that something to curse the Lord's name with? Deliverance, when all it delivered was death and chains heavier than iron. She was just a slip of a girl then, no more than 13 summers, with skin dark as rich earth, and eyes that held the memory of African drums. Her mama had named her something beautiful in their tongue, a name that meant born of lightning. But them slave traders, they stripped that name clean off her like they stripped everything else. Called her Ava, 'cause it was easy on their lazy tongues. The Middle Passage, sweet Jesus. That journey was 43 days of hell opened up on the ocean. Bodies packed like cargo, chained wrist to ankle. Children crying for mothers who'd already crossed over to the other side. The ship creaked and moaned like it was carrying more than flesh, like it was carrying the weight of stolen souls. Ava's mama died on day 21. Fever took her, but not before she pressed something into Ava's palm. A small piece of bone carved with marks that looked like lightning. "Keep this," her mama whispered, "and remember who you are when they try to make you forget." When that cursed ship finally reached Charleston Harbor, Ava stepped onto American soil with nothing but that bone charm and a heart full of rage quiet as deep water. The auction block was waiting, all wooden and stained with tears nobody bothered to wipe clean. Old man Pettigrew from Hollow Creek Plantation bought Ava for $300, paid in silver coins that clinked like tiny church bells celebrating her doom. He was a man built like a tree trunk, with hands big enough to crush skulls and eyes cold as January frost. When he looked at Ava, he wasn't seeing a child. He was seeing property that needed breaking in. The wagon ride to Hollow Creek took 2 days through Georgia red clay and cotton fields that stretched wide as the sky. Ava sat chained in the back, watching the land roll by, knowing she was moving further and further away from any chance of seeing home again. Hollow Creek Plantation sprawled across 5,000 acres of cursed ground, with cotton plants growing tall as gravestones far as the eye could see. The big house sat on a hill like a whitewashed throne, looking down on the slave quarters with windows that watched everything and forgave nothing. When they reached the plantation, Old man Pettigrew dragged Ava straight to the blacksmith shop where a fire was already burning hot. The overseer, a mean-spirited man named Dutch Morrison, was heating up a branding fork in them flames. "Every piece of property gets marked," Pettigrew said, his voice dry as dead leaves. "So we know what belongs to who." That fork glowed red-hot, then white-hot, like a piece of the sun torn off and hammered into the shape of suffering. Dutch Morrison held it up, and the heat from it made the air shimmer like a mirage. "Hold her steady," Pettigrew commanded. 2 field hands grabbed Ava's arms, and she could smell the fear pouring off them like sweat. They knew what was coming. They'd seen it before. The fork came down slow, and when it touched the soft skin above Ava's collarbone, the pain was like lightning striking flesh. Her scream tore through the plantation air, sent birds flying from trees, made dogs howl in the distance. But that wasn't the worst part, no sir. The worst part was the smell of her own skin cooking, and the sound Pettigrew made, a satisfied grunt like he was tasting good food. When they finally let her go, Ava collapsed to her knees, clutching that burn mark that would never heal right. The other slaves helped her to the quarters, their faces carved with sorrow and recognition. "Welcome to hell, child," whispered an old woman named Mama June. "Now you know where you stand." But Ava looked up at her through tears and pain, and her voice came out steady as stone. "I ain't standing nowhere. I'm just passing through. Now you see, people, that first mark was like breaking the seal on a bottle of poison. Once it was done, couldn't nobody put it back. 3 days after that branding, Ava was working the cotton fields when she made her first mistake. She looked old man Pettigrew straight in the eyes, didn't lower her gaze, didn't shuffle her feet, didn't show the proper fear a slave was supposed to carry. "You got something to say to me, gal?" Pettigrew asked, stopping his horse right beside her row of cotton. Ava kept picking, her fingers moving steady through the white bowls, but her eyes stayed on his. No, sir. Then why you looking at me like you got fire in your belly? Just looking, sir. Didn't know looking was against the law. Dutch Morrison was riding up behind Pettigrew, and when he heard that sass, his face went dark as a storm cloud. Boss, this one needs reminding about her place. Pettigrew climbed down from his horse slow, like a man who enjoyed taking his time with violence. Get the fork, Dutch. The field hands around Ava started backing away, but she stood her ground, cotton basket still in her hands. Inside her head she could hear her mama's voice. Born of lightning, born of lightning. They dragged her back to the blacksmith shop, and this time a crowd gathered. Pettigrew wanted everybody to see what happened when you forgot your place. The fire was already burning from the morning's work, and Dutch Morrison slid that fork into the flames like he was cooking supper. This is mark number 2, Pettigrew announced to the crowd, and if this gal keeps acting like she's free, there's gonna be many more where this came from. The fork came out glowing angry red, and they pressed Ava face down over a tree stump. This time they aimed for her shoulder blade, right where it would hurt the most when she tried to sleep. When that metal touched her skin, Ava's scream was different, longer, deeper, like it was coming from someplace way down inside her soul. But at the end of that scream, she did something that made everybody step back. She laughed. Not a happy laugh, no sir. A laugh like broken glass, like the sound a wildcat makes when it's cornered. A laugh that said, "You can burn me, but you can't break me." Pettigrew's face went white. What the hell? Hurt, Ava said, pushing herself up from that stump with the fork mark still smoking on her back. But it ain't the worst pain I ever felt. You think you're tough, do you? Ava turned around, and her eyes was like looking into a deep well at midnight. I think pain is just pain, massa, and I've been carrying pain since the day I was born. Dutch Morrison stepped forward, but Pettigrew held up his hand. Something in Ava's voice made him uneasy, like maybe he'd bit off more than he could chew. Take her back to the quarters, he said, but keep an eye on this one, she's gonna be trouble. As they walked Ava back to the slave cabins, the other field hands whispered among themselves. Some said she was crazy, some said she was possessed. But old Mama June, who'd seen more overseers come and go than anybody, said something different. That child's got something in her that don't bend, she told the women in the cabin that night as they cleaned Ava's burns with salt water and rags. I seen it before back in my grandmother's time. Some folks is just born with fire in their bones. Ava lay on her belly on a straw mattress, biting down on a piece of leather so she wouldn't scream from the cleaning. When Mama June finished doctoring her, she rolled over and stared up at the cabin ceiling. How many marks you think a person can take before they die? She asked. The cabin went quiet as death. Depends on the person, said a woman named Sarah, who had 3 marks of her own. Some folks die after one, some last longer. I ain't planning to die, Ava said. Not from no fork, not from no overseer, not from no massa. Then what you planning to do? Mama June asked. Ava touched the bone charm her mama had given her, hidden inside her dress where nobody could see it. I'm planning to remember. Remember what? That lightning don't die when it hits the ground. It just waits for the next storm. The Senzala. That's what the old folks called the slave quarters, using words that came from across the water. Was a place where secrets grew in the dark like mushrooms after rain. And after Ava's second burning, her name started growing in whispers. The quarters at Hollow Creek was built like a small town of sorrow, with 12 cabins arranged in 2 rows facing each other across a dirt yard. Each cabin held 8 to 10 souls, packed tight as sardines, with one fireplace for cooking and warming, and walls thin as paper. In the 3rd cabin from the left, where Ava slept with 9 other women and children, the talk at night centered around one question. What manner of girl was this who laughed at the Brandon Fork? Old Mama June, who'd been at Hollow Creek longer than anybody could remember, had seen plenty of young folks come and go. Most broke quick under the weight of slavery. The ones who lasted learned to keep their heads down, their voices quiet, their dreams buried deep. But Ava, Lord have mercy, That child was different. She didn't shuffle when she walked, didn't mumble, "Yes, massa," like the others. When Dutch Morrison rode through the fields on his horse, cracking his whip just to hear the sound, most slaves hunched their shoulders and worked faster. Ava kept her back straight. "Child's got a death wish," said a woman named Ruth, who picked cotton in the row next to Ava's. "She gonna get us all in trouble with her proud ways." But Mama June saw something different. In the evenings, when the work was done and the overseer had gone back to his house, she watched Ava sit by herself outside the cabin. The girl would take out a small piece of carved bone and hold it up to the moonlight, moving her lips in words nobody else could hear. "What you doing out there, child?" Mama June finally asked one night. Ava looked up from her bone charm. "Talking to my people." "Your people dead and gone, honey. Ain't nobody left to talk to." "Dead ain't gone," Ava said, her voice steady as river stones. "Dead is just waiting on the other side of the water, and when the time comes, they gonna answer." Mama June felt a chill run down her spine. She'd heard talk like that before, back when she was young, from the conjure women who knew the old ways. "Where you learn to talk like that?" "From my mama, before the fever took her. She said our people been fighting death for 1,000 years and we ain't lost yet." "And what your mama tell you about branding forks and overseers?" Ava's smile was sharp as a knife blade. "She told me that fire recognizes fire, and when the time comes for burning, you got to decide who's gonna be the flame and who's gonna be the kindling." Word about Ava's strange ways spread through the quarters like honey through warm bread. Some folks started crossing themselves when she walked by, making signs against evil with their fingers. Others started bringing her small offerings: a piece of cornbread, a cup of cool water, a flower picked from beside the creek. The children especially seemed drawn to her. They'd sit around her in the evenings and listen while she told stories about Africa, about warriors who rode lions and queens who could call down lightning from the sky. "Tell us about the lion riders," little Moses would beg, his eyes wide as saucers. "Long time ago," Ava would say, her voice taking on a singing quality. "Before the ships came, before the chains came, our people lived in cities made of gold and dreams. The warriors rode lions big as horses, and their roars could be heard from one end of the kingdom to the other." "Did they have marks on them like you got?" asked a little girl named Penny, reaching out to touch the burned scar on Ava's collarbone. "No, baby. They had marks of honor. Scars they chose, patterns that told their stories. Not like these marks I got, which is just marks of meanness." "When you gonna get your honor marks?" Moses asked. Ava looked up at the stars, and for a moment her face was like carved stone. "When I earn 'em." But it wasn't just the children who were drawn to Ava. The old ones, the ones who remembered fragments of the homeland, who still carried songs in languages the overseer couldn't understand. They started watching her with different eyes. Uncle Simeon, who worked in the blacksmith shop and had to heat the Brandon fork every time Pettigrew wanted to mark somebody, pulled Ava aside one evening. "Girl, you playing with fire," he said, his voice low and urgent. "And I don't mean the kind that burns skin. I mean the kind that burns down whole plantations." "Maybe that's what needs burning," Ava replied. "Maybe so. But you remember this. Fire don't choose who it burns. When the flames start rising, innocent folks gonna get caught up too." Ava nodded, but her eyes stayed hard. "Uncle Simeon, how many innocent folks already burning in this place? How many children gonna grow up with Brandon fork marks? How many women gonna die birthing babies for Massa's profit?" Uncle Simeon couldn't answer that. Nobody could. 3 weeks after her second marking, Ava was working the cotton fields when Dutch Morrison rode up with news that made everybody's blood run cold. "Pettigrew's got company coming tomorrow," he announced. "Some plantation owners from South Carolina, and he wants to show off his operation. That means every one of you better be on your best behavior." He looked straight at Ava when he said it. "And if anybody causes trouble while the guests are here, they gonna wish they'd never been born." That night in the quarters, fear hung in the air thick as smoke. Everybody knew what company meant. It meant Pettigrew would be looking for ways to impress his visitors. And impressing rich white men usually involved demonstrating how well he controlled his slaves. "Just keep your head down tomorrow," Mama June begged Ava. Don't give him no excuse. But Ava was staring out the cabin window at the big house on the hill, where lights glowed warm and yellow in every room. "Mama June," she said quietly, "you ever wonder what it feels like to be the one holding the brand and fork instead of the one getting burned?" And right then, everybody in that cabin knew trouble was coming fast as a summer storm. The whispers would carry Ava's name from quarter to quarter, plantation to plantation, until it became something more than just a name, until it became a promise that somewhere out there was a girl who refused to break, no matter how hot the iron got. The old ones say that on that night, if you listened real close, you could hear the ancestors stirring in their graves, getting ready for what was coming. 'Cause some souls don't go gentle into bondage. Some souls burn back. Now listen here, child, and let me paint you a picture of Hollow Creek Plantation. 'Cause you got to understand the ground where this blood was spilled to understand the story that grew from it. Hollow Creek stretched across the red Georgia earth like a kingdom built on bones and cotton. 5,000 acres of cursed land, with fields that rolled on forever under a sun that never showed mercy to the folks working beneath it. The cotton plants grew tall and white as tombstones, and when the wind blew through them, they whispered secrets only the dead could understand. The big house sat on the highest hill, white-painted and proud, with columns tall as ancient trees and windows that watched everything like jealous eyes. Inside that house lived Old Man Pettigrew, his pale wife who never came outside, and their 3 sons who'd been raised to see black skin as nothing more than walking property. Behind the big house was the overseer's cabin, where Dutch Morrison lived alone with his whiskey bottles and his collection of whips. That man had come from somewhere up north, but slavery had poisoned his soul so deep, you couldn't tell where the devil ended and Dutch Morrison began. The slave quarters sat down in the valley, 12 cabins arranged like a small town of sorrow, with dirt paths between them that turned to mud when the rains came. Each cabin was built from rough-hewn logs chinked with clay, with one room for living and sleeping and praying and dying. The roofs leaked when it stormed, and in winter the cold came through them walls like hungry ghosts. But the worst part of Hollow Creek wasn't the cabins or even the big house. The worst part was what they called the disciplinary ground, a cleared space near the blacksmith shop where they kept the whipping post, the branding station, and a set of stocks for punishment. The whipping post was made from a live oak tree, thick as 3 men, and scarred with the marks of 1,000 lashes. They'd carved notches in the bark for every slave who died tied to that tree, and the notches went all the way around twice. Next to the whipping post stood the branding station, a forge that was always kept hot, with irons and forks hanging on hooks like the devil's own kitchen utensils. The smell of charcoal and heated metal hung in the air there, permanent-like, mixed with something else nobody wanted to name. And overlooking it all was the auction block, a wooden platform where new slaves got sold and old slaves got traded away from their families. The wood was stained dark with tears and blood, and on quiet nights you could hear it creaking even when nobody was standing on it. The cotton fields themselves was laid out in perfect rows that stretched from the quarters to the creek, with paths between them just wide enough for a horse and rider. During picking season, them fields was filled with bent backs and aching hands, moving slow through the white sea like ships in a nightmare. At the edge of the plantation, where the cleared land met the wild forest, stood the old slave graveyard. Wasn't no headstones, just wooden crosses and piles of rocks marking where folks had been laid to rest. The trees around that graveyard was draped with Spanish moss that looked like burial shrouds, and at night you could see lights dancing between the graves. The old ones called them the spirits of the unquiet dead. Now, on the morning when Pettigrew's company was coming, the whole plantation was buzzing with nervous energy. Dutch Morrison rode through the quarters before dawn, his whip cracking like thunder. "Everybody up, everybody working. Any slave I catch loafing today gets 20 lashes. Ava rose with the others, but she moved different than the rest. While everybody else was hurrying and stumbling over themselves with fear, she walked steady and calm, like she was heading to Sunday service instead of a day of cotton picking under the eyes of visiting masters. "Girl, what's wrong with you?" hissed Ruth, the woman who worked the row next to hers. "Don't you know what day this is?" "I know what day this is," Ava replied, tying her head wrap tight. It's the day I've been waiting for. Out in the fields, the work began before the sun was full up. The visiting plantation owners would arrive around midday, which meant everything had to look perfect. The cotton had to be picked clean, the paths had to be swept, and every slave had to appear properly broken and obedient. But as the morning wore on, it became clear that something was stirring in the air. The field hands kept glancing toward the big house, where carriages were starting to arrive. Rich white men in fine clothes climbed down from their conveyances, laughing and talking loud about crops and profits and the best ways to manage difficult slaves. Ava worked her row methodical-like, her hands moving through the cotton bolls, steady as a heartbeat. But her eyes kept drifting to the disciplinary ground, where Dutch Morrison was building up the fire in the forge. The sight of them flames made her fingers close around the bone charm hidden in her dress. Around noon, Pettigrew himself came riding through the fields on his big black stallion, with his guests following behind on their own horses. They moved slow, like kings surveying their domain, pointing at different slaves and discussing them like they was livestock. "That buck there," said a fat man with gold teeth pointing at Uncle Simeon. "Fine specimen, good for breeding. How much you pay for him?" 2,000, Pettigrew replied. "But he's more than paid for himself in offspring." When they reached Ava's section, Pettigrew pulled up his horse. "Now, here's something interesting, gentlemen. See that girl there with the scars? Bought her off a ship 3 months ago, and she's been giving me trouble ever since." The visiting masters leaned forward in their saddles, studying Ava like she was a curiosity in a traveling show. "What kind of trouble?" asked a thin man with pale eyes. "Insubordination, defiance. I've had to mark her twice already, and she still won't learn her place." "Some of them never do," said another visitor. "Best thing is to break them early and hard." "That's exactly what I intend to do," Pettigrew said, his voice carrying across the cotton field. "Matter of fact, I think today would be perfect for a demonstration." Ava's hands never stopped moving through the cotton, but every slave in hearing distance felt their blood turn cold. They knew what was coming. "Dutch," Pettigrew called out, "fire up the forge. We're going to show our guests how we handle troublesome property at Hollow Creek." Dutch Morrison's whip cracked once in acknowledgement, and smoke began rising from the disciplinary ground. As the morning turned toward afternoon, word spread through the quarters like wildfire. Ava was going to be marked again, in front of company, as entertainment for visiting masters. Some folks whispered prayers, others started crying quiet tears. But Ava herself seemed calm as deep water. She finished her row, set down her cotton sack, and walked toward the disciplinary ground with her head held high. "Where you going, child?" called out Mama June. Ava turned back, and her smile was like lightning splitting a dark sky. "Going to meet my destiny," she said, "and maybe teach it a lesson or two." That's when everybody knew that what was about to happen wasn't just another punishment. It was the beginning of something that would shake Hollow Creek Plantation down to its very foundations. The old ones say you could feel it in the air that day, a tension like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. The ancestors were stirring. The spirits of the unquiet dead were gathering, and somewhere in the distance you could almost hear the sound of chains beginning to break. Suffering so bad, Lord have mercy. But that's when Ava learned the hardest lesson of all: how to turn pain into power, how to make silence speak louder than screaming. By the time they reached mark number 10, Ava had stopped crying altogether. The tears had dried up like a well in drought season, leaving behind something harder and colder than stone. Each time that branding fork touched her skin, she'd bite down on a piece of leather and let the fire burn through her without making a sound. Dutch Morrison didn't like that silence, not one bit. "She's supposed to scream," he told Pettigrew after the 10th marking, wiping sweat from his forehead. "They all supposed to scream. How else they gonna learn?" But Pettigrew was beginning to see something different in Ava's quiet endurance. Where Dutch saw defiance, Pettigrew saw possibility. The possibility of breaking something that had never been broken before. "Let her stay quiet," he said. "We'll see how long that lasts." Mark 11 came after Ava was caught teaching little Moses his letters, scratching words in the dirt behind the smokehouse. Slaves weren't supposed to read. Knowledge was dangerous in the hands of property. Mark 12 came when she helped old Uncle Thomas hide a leg injury so he wouldn't be sold away from his daughter. Mark 13 came for singing. Not just any singing, but singing in the old language, words that sounded like they came from across the water, from the homeland that lived only in memory now. Each time, Ava walked to the disciplinary ground on her own 2 feet. Each time she knelt without being forced. Each time she took the burning iron without begging for mercy. And each time, the silence that followed was deeper and more terrible than any scream. The other slaves started watching her different after Mark 15. They'd seen plenty of folks get broken by the brand and fork, seen strong men reduced to whimpering children after one touch of hot iron. But here was this slip of a girl, taking burn after burn, and somehow getting stronger instead of weaker. "Ain't natural," whispered Sarah, the woman from the second cabin. "No person should be able to stand that much fire." But Mama June, who'd seen more years than anybody, had a different thought. "Maybe she ain't just a person," she said quietly. "Maybe she's something more." It was after Mark 20 that Ava started talking to herself during the brandings. Not crying, not pleading, but talking low and steady in words that made Dutch Morrison nervous. "What's she saying?" he asked Uncle Simeon, who was forced to help hold Ava down. Uncle Simeon listened for a moment. Then his face went gray as ash. "She's calling on the ancestors," he said, "asking them to remember this place, to remember what's being done here." "That's heathen talk," Dutch snarled, but his hands were shaking as he heated the fork. "Maybe so," Uncle Simeon replied. "But heathen or not, them ancestors got long memories, and they don't forget debts." By Mark 30, even Pettigrew was starting to feel uneasy. He'd intended to break Ava's spirit, to turn her into an example for the other slaves. Instead, she was becoming something else entirely, a symbol of resistance that was spreading through the quarters like fever. The slave children had started following her around, listening to her stories about warriors and queens and people who refused to bow down to anyone. The adults looked at her with a mixture of fear and hope, like she was carrying a flame that might either save them all or burn them all alive. "She's becoming a problem," Dutch Morrison warned. "The others are starting to look at her like she's some kind of saint." "Then we'll mark her until she's not," Pettigrew replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Mark 40 came on a day when thunder was rolling across the sky without any rain. Ava knelt at the forge, and for the first time she spoke directly to Pettigrew. "You can burn my body," she said, her voice steady as river rocks, "but you can't touch what lives inside me." "And what's that?" Pettigrew asked, curious despite himself. "The memory of being free," Ava replied, "and the promise that someday I'm gonna be free again." The fork came down, and this time Ava didn't just stay silent. She sang, a low, haunting melody in words that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the bones buried in the slave graveyard, from the spirits that danced between the moss-draped trees. Dutch Morrison dropped the fork like it had burned him. "Boss," he said, his voice cracking, "maybe we should—" "Pick it up," Pettigrew ordered. "Finish the job." But when Dutch Morrison bent to retrieve the fork, his hands were shaking so bad he could barely hold it. The song Ava was singing seemed to be calling something out of the air, something that made the hair on the back of every neck stand up straight. That night in the quarters, the mood was different than it had ever been before. Instead of despair, there was something else stirring, something that felt dangerous and wild and full of possibility. "She's changing," Mama June told the women gathered around the fire. "Each time they burn her, she's becoming more herself instead of less." "What you mean?" asked Ruth. "I mean, she's remembering something they've been trying to make us all forget. She's remembering that we used to be more than slaves. We used to be people with power." A young woman named Celia, who'd been born on the plantation and never known anything but bondage, looked up with wonder in her eyes. "You think she could teach us? Teach us how to be like her?" Mama June looked toward Ava's sleeping form, where fresh bandages covered the latest burn. "Child, I think that's exactly what she's doing, one mark at a time. Outside, the thunder was still rolling across the Georgia sky, and somewhere in the distance, wolves were howling like they were calling to something ancient and wild and absolutely unafraid. The old ones would later say that Mark 40 was when Ava stopped being just a slave who refused to break and became something else entirely. Something that would grow and spread and eventually consume everything that tried to contain it. The fire that was meant to destroy her was forging her into something harder than iron, sharper than steel, and more dangerous than anything old man Pettigrew had ever dreamed of owning. Great God Almighty, when that 100th mark burned into Ava's flesh, something shifted in the very air around Hollow Creek Plantation. The girl who'd arrived in chains 3 years before was gone, and in her place stood something the old ones recognized from stories their grandmothers used to whisper. She was becoming ruin and stone, becoming memory made flesh. The morning of her 100th marking, Ava woke before dawn and walked to the creek that ran along the edge of the plantation. The water was clear and cold, and she knelt beside it like she was attending church service. "Mama," she whispered to the flowing water, touching the bone charm hidden in her dress. "I can feel you watching. I can feel all of them watching." The creek gurgled and splashed, and for just a moment it sounded like voices singing in harmony. The voices of all the women who'd crossed the Atlantic in slave ships, all the mothers who'd had their children sold away, all the daughters who'd died with freedom still burning in their hearts. When Ava stood up from the creek bank, something had changed in her face. The pain was still there, carved deep as river valleys, but there was something else now, too. Something that made Dutch Morrison step backward when she walked past him on her way to the fields. "Morning, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice polite as Sunday preaching. Dutch Morrison just grunted and spurred his horse faster, like he was trying to get away from something he couldn't name. That day in the cotton fields, Ava worked with a rhythm that seemed to match some deeper heartbeat. Her hands moved through the white bowls like she was conducting music only she could hear. The other slaves found themselves matching her pace without meaning to, and before long the whole section was moving in time with Ava's silent song. "You hear that?" whispered a field hand named Jonas. "Hear what?" asked his partner. "Listen close." They all stopped working for a moment and tilted their heads toward the sky. There, underneath the sound of wind through cotton and the distant lowing of cattle, was something else. A humming. A vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. "That's coming from her," Jonas said, pointing at Ava. And it was. Ava was humming so low and quiet that it was more felt than heard. A sound that seemed to connect with something deep in the ground, something that had been sleeping for a long, long time. When the noon bell rang and they broke for their meager meal, Ava didn't head back to the quarters like the others. Instead, she walked straight toward the disciplinary ground, where Dutch Morrison was already heating the forge for her 100th marking. "You in a hurry to get burned today?" Dutch asked, his voice trying to sound tough but coming out shaky. "Just ready to get it over with," Ava replied. She knelt by the forge without being told, and for the first time in months she looked directly into Dutch Morrison's eyes. What she saw there made her smile. Fear. Pure, cold, bone-deep fear. "You're scared of me," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I ain't scared of no slave girl," Dutch Morrison blustered, but his hands were trembling as he pulled the fork from the fire. "Yes, you are. You're scared because you can feel it too, can't you? You can feel them watching." "Feel what watching?" "The ancestors, the spirits, all the people you helped torture and kill. They're all here now, Dutch Morrison. They're all waiting." The fork in Dutch's hand was glowing white-hot, but he hesitated. All around the disciplinary ground, slaves had gathered to watch. This wasn't unusual. Pettigrew liked audiences for his punishments. But something was different this time. The slaves weren't looking at the ground or cowering in fear. They were standing straight, looking directly at what was happening, and their faces were carved with something that looked dangerously like hope. "Get on with it, Dutch," called Pettigrew from where he sat on his horse. "We don't have all day." Dutch Morrison raised the fork and Ava began to sing. This time, it wasn't in the old language from across the water. This time, she sang in English. clear and strong, so everybody could understand every word. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water. The other slaves knew that song. It was a spiritual they sang in the praise house on Sundays. But the way Ava was singing it, it sounded like something else entirely. It sounded like a battle cry. See that host all dressed in white? The leader looks like the Israelite wade in the water, children. When the fork touched her skin for the 100th time, Ava's voice didn't break. If anything, it got stronger. The burn mark sizzled and smoked, filling the air with the smell of cooking flesh. But Ava kept singing like she was calling down angels from heaven. And then something impossible happened. The other slaves started singing too. It began with Mama June, her old voice cracking but determined. Then Uncle Simeon joined in, his deep bass adding weight to the melody. One by one, every slave gathered around the disciplinary ground opened their mouths and sang, "Wade in the water, wade in the water, children wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water." Dutch Morrison stumbled backward, the fork falling from his nerveless fingers. He'd never heard slaves sing during a punishment, never heard anything like the power that was building in that circle of voices. Pettigrew was shouting something, trying to restore order, but his voice was lost in the rising tide of song. The slaves weren't stopping. If anything, they were getting louder, their voices blending together into something that sounded like freedom itself, learning how to sing. If you don't believe I've been redeemed, just follow me down to Jordan's stream. Wade in the water, children. When the song finally ended, the silence that followed was deeper than any quiet that had ever settled over Hollow Creek Plantation. Ava rose to her feet, the fresh burn mark still smoking on her arm, and looked around at the faces surrounding her. For the first time since arriving in chains, she wasn't alone. "Get back to work!" Pettigrew screamed, his face red with rage. "All of you, get back to work now!" The slaves began to disperse, but slowly, reluctantly, like people leaving a church service that had touched something holy in their souls. As they walked away, many of them touched Ava's shoulder or whispered words of blessing in her ear. That night in the quarters, the mood was electric. Children who'd never spoken above a whisper were laughing out loud. Adults who'd been beaten down for years were sitting up straight, looking each other in the eye, talking about things they'd never dared to speak before. "Something's changing," said a woman named Grace. "Can y'all feel it? Something in the air is different." "It's her," said Uncle Simeon, nodding toward where Ava sat by the fire, tending her latest wound with calm, steady hands. "She's teaching us how to remember who we used to be." Ava looked up from her bandaging and smiled. But this wasn't the broken smile of someone who'd been burned 100 times. This was the smile of someone who'd discovered fire couldn't destroy what truly mattered. "We ain't just remembering," she said. "We're getting ready." "Ready for what?" asked little Moses. Ava's eyes reflected the firelight like dark mirrors. "Ready to wade in the water," she said. "Ready to let God trouble it." Outside the cabin windows, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. But for the first time in years, it didn't feel like the rain was washing hope away. It felt like it was watering something that was finally ready to grow. Lord of glory, when that 200th mark burned into Ava's flesh, her body had become a map of scars, each one telling the story of a soul that refused to surrender. The girl was gone now, replaced by something that even the overseers whispered about when they thought nobody was listening. 4 years had passed since the singing at the 100th marking, and Hollow Creek Plantation had changed in ways that made Old Man Pettigrew wake up in cold sweats. The slaves still worked his fields, still picked his cotton, still called him Massa when he rode by. But there was something different in their eyes now, something that made him check the locks on his doors twice each night. It had started small, little acts of resistance that could be explained away as accidents. Tools went missing. Cotton sacks developed mysterious holes. Work songs took on new verses that sounded suspiciously like coded messages. But Ava, sweet Jesus, what had Ava become? She moved through the plantation now like a walking legend. The scars covering her arms, back, and shoulders had formed patterns that looked almost like writing, like her skin was carrying messages from the ancestors themselves. When she walked, even the meanest overseer would step aside without knowing why. The children followed her everywhere, hanging on every word she spoke. The adults sought her out for advice, for comfort, for the kind of spiritual guidance that used to come from preachers back in the homeland. And the old ones looked at her with recognition, like they were seeing something they'd been waiting their whole lives to witness. She's becoming what our people call a griot, Mama June told the women gathered around the fire one night. A keeper of stories, a guardian of memory. What kind of stories? Asked Ruth. The kind that remind us who we really are. The kind that tell us freedom ain't just a dream. It's a promise. Ava sat apart from the group, her back straight against the cabin wall, her eyes fixed on something nobody else could see. Lately, she'd been having visions, glimpses of things that hadn't happened yet, voices that called to her from across the water, dreams that felt more real than waking life. In these visions, she saw fire, not the small fire of a branding fork, but great flames that consumed everything built on stolen land and unpaid labor. She saw herself standing in those flames, not burning but shining, holding something in her hands that looked like justice made solid. The 200th marking had come after Ava was caught teaching a group of slave children not just letters, but numbers, showing them how to count the days until they turned 18, how to calculate distances to the North Star, how to figure the odds of a successful escape. Dutch Morrison had found them behind the smokehouse, scratching figures in the dirt with pieces of charcoal, and his face had gone white as bleached cotton. "You teaching them to read? To cipher?" he'd demanded. "I'm teaching them to think," Ava had replied calmly. "Thought you'd want your property to be smart enough to work better." But they both knew what she was really doing. She was teaching them to dream in numbers, to see freedom as something that could be measured and planned for, not just hoped for. The branding that followed was the worst yet. Pettigrew had ordered the fork heated until it glowed like a fallen star, and the mark it left went deeper than any before. But Ava had taken it the same way she took them all, in silence with her eyes fixed on something beyond the pain. "What you looking at?" Dutch Morrison had asked as he pressed the iron to her flesh. "The future," Ava had whispered, "and it's beautiful." Now, sitting in the cabin with her latest wound still fresh, Ava was seeing more visions. This time, she saw water, deep, dark water that moved like it was alive, carrying voices from all the slaves who'd been thrown overboard during the Middle Passage. She saw herself walking into that water, not to drown, but to be baptized into something new. "Ava," called little Moses, now 8 years old and one of her most devoted followers. "Tell us a story." Ava turned from whatever she'd been staring at and smiled. The smile transformed her scarred face, made it beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with unmarked skin. "What kind of story you want to hear, baby?" "Tell us about the warrior queens," said a little girl named Blessing. "Tell us about the ones who never got caught." Ava gathered the children around her, their faces glowing in the firelight like small brown moons. But tonight her story was different from the ones she'd told before. "Long time ago," she began, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of the griots, "there was a queen named Nzinga who fought the slave traders for 30 years. She had an army of men and women who'd escaped from the ships, who'd broken their chains and learned to fight back." The children leaned closer, hungry for every word. "Queen Nzinga never let herself be captured, never let herself be sold. And you know why? Because she understood something that her enemies didn't understand." "What?" whispered Moses. "She understood that freedom ain't something somebody can give you. Freedom is something you take." The adults in the cabin had stopped their own conversations to listen. Even Mama June, who'd heard 1,000 stories in her long life, was hanging on every word. "Now, Queen Nzinga had this way of fighting that confused her enemies," Ava continued. "She wouldn't meet them head-on where they expected her to. Instead, she'd disappear into the forest, into the mountains, into places where their heavy armor and their guns couldn't follow. "Like a ghost," said Blessing. "Exactly like a ghost. And when they thought they'd won, when they thought they'd chased her away forever, she'd come back. Always came back. Because you can't kill an idea whose time has come." Uncle Simeon, listening from the doorway, felt a chill run down his spine. The way Ava was telling this story, it didn't sound like something that happened long ago and far away. It sounded like a plan. "What happened to Queen Nzinga?" asked Moses. "She died free," Ava said simply. "Died in her own palace, surrounded by her own people, never having bowed to anybody who tried to claim they owned her." The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. In that silence, each person was imagining what it might feel like to die free, to live long enough to see the chains broken, to breathe air that didn't taste like bondage. "Ava," said Mama June softly, "you telling us more than just stories, ain't you?" Ava's eyes met the old woman's, and for a moment something passed between them that was older than words. "Stories are just the beginning, Mama June. Stories teach us to remember. But remembering ain't enough. What comes after remembering?" Ava touched the bone charm hidden in her dress, the one her mother had pressed into her palm on that slave ship so many years ago. The charm was warm, like it was carrying heat from some distant fire. "After remembering comes reckoning," she said. Outside the cabin, thunder was rumbling across the Georgia sky, and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. But this wasn't the gentle rain that watered crops. This was the kind of rain that washed things away, that changed the shape of the land, that made rivers jump their banks and find new paths to the sea. In the big house on the hill, Old Man Pettigrew was having trouble sleeping. He kept hearing things, voices in languages he didn't recognize, drums that seemed to beat in rhythm with his own heart, songs that made his blood feel cold in his veins. His wife had taken to her bed with nervous exhaustion, claiming that the very air around the plantation felt charged with malevolent energy. His overseers were drinking more, working harder to maintain control, but still reporting strange incidents they couldn't explain. Tools that move by themselves, horses that refused to approach certain parts of the plantation, dogs that whined and cowered when they passed the slave quarters, like they could sense something their masters couldn't see. "It's that girl," Dutch Morrison had told him that morning. "That Ava, she's the center of it all. Ever since she started collecting all them marks, the others been looking at her like she's some kind of prophet." "Then maybe it's time to stop marking her," Pettigrew had replied. "Maybe it's time for a permanent solution." But even as he said it, something in his gut warned him that killing Ava might be the worst mistake he could make. Because some people, when you kill them, don't stay dead. Some people become more dangerous as martyrs than they ever were as living rebels. In the slave quarters, Ava was finishing her story time, sending the children to their sleeping places with words of blessing and protection. As the cabin settled into quiet, she remained by the fire, staring into flames that seemed to hold shapes and shadows of things not yet born. "You seeing something in that fire?" asked Uncle Simeon. Ava nodded slowly. "I'm seeing the end of this place. I'm seeing the day when cotton grows wild in them fields because ain't nobody left to pick it under the whip. And when you think that day gonna come?" Ava touched her newest scar, the 200th mark that still throbbed with each beat of her heart. "Sooner than they think," she said. "Sooner than they can prepare for." The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks up toward the roof of the cabin. And for just a moment, those sparks looked like they were forming letters in some ancient alphabet that spelled out words of prophecy and promise. The reckoning was coming to Hollow Creek Plantation, and it would arrive wearing the face of a woman whose body was a map of every cruelty ever committed there, every injustice that had ever been allowed to stand, every soul that had ever cried out for justice and been silenced. 200 marks down, 200 to go. But the next 100 would be different. The next 100 would be counted not in scars received, but in chains broken, in voices raised, in the sound of freedom learning how to sing. Mercy me. When that 300th mark seared into Ava's flesh, Even old man Pettigrew himself started to feel like maybe he'd grabbed hold of something too big for his hands. The woman who knelt before his branding fork wasn't the same creature who'd stepped off that slave ship 5 years before. This was something else entirely, something that made hardened overseers cross themselves when they thought nobody was looking. The morning of the 300th marking dawned gray and heavy, with clouds hanging low like smoke from some distant fire. The air itself felt charged, like the moments before lightning strikes, and every animal on the plantation was acting strange. The horses wouldn't take their bits. The dogs kept howling for no reason. Even the chickens had stopped laying, clustering together in their coops like they were preparing for some natural disaster that only they could sense. In the slave quarters, Ava woke before dawn and walked to her usual place by the creek. But this time, she wasn't alone. Uncle Simeon was there, and Mama June, and a dozen other slaves who'd risen early to, what? To witness? To pray? To say goodbye? Because everybody could feel it. Something was building to a breaking point. "Child," Mama June said softly, "you don't have to keep taking these marks. There's other ways to resist. Quieter ways." Ava knelt by the water's edge, cupping the cold creek in her palms and splashing it on her face. The water ran down her cheeks like tears, but her eyes were dry as bone. "Mama June," she said, "you ever watch a blacksmith work? How he heats the metal again and again, hammering it until it becomes something stronger than it was before. I seen it. Well, that's what's happening here. Every mark they put on me, they think they're breaking me down. But really, they're forging me into something they ain't never seen before." Uncle Simeon stepped forward, his face grave with worry. "Ava, folks are starting to talk about what might happen when you reach 400. Some are saying you planning something that could get us all killed." Ava stood up from the creek bank, water still dripping from her hands. When she turned to face the group, there was something in her expression that made them all step back involuntarily. "Uncle Simeon," she said, her voice quiet but carrying like she was speaking in a cathedral, "how many of our people you think died on them slave ships? How many got thrown overboard, whipped to death, worked until their hearts just stopped beating? Too many to count. And how many more gonna die if we just keep our heads down, keep taking whatever they give us, keep hoping that being good slaves will somehow make them treat us like human beings?" Uncle Simeon couldn't answer that. Nobody could. "I ain't planning nothing," Ava continued. "I'm just getting ready to be who I was always meant to be. And if that scares folks, well, maybe it should scare them." That morning in the fields, the tension was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. Dutch Morrison rode his rounds with his hand resting on the pistol at his hip, and the other overseers carried their whips at the ready like they expected trouble to break out any moment. But the slaves worked in perfect silence, their movements coordinated in a way that seemed almost supernatural. They picked cotton in rhythm, moved down the rows in patterns that looked random but felt intentional, and every so often, one of them would start humming a melody that the others would pick up and carry forward. It was like watching an army prepare for battle, except the army was pretending to be doing nothing but picking cotton. Ava worked at the center of it all, her hands moving through the white bowls with mechanical precision, her mind somewhere else entirely. In her visions, she could see what was coming as clear as if it had already happened. She saw fire. She saw blood. She saw the end of everything that had kept her people in chains, and she saw herself standing in the middle of it all, no longer the victim of the branding fork, but its master. When the dinner bell rang and the slaves began filing back toward the quarters for their evening meal, Dutch Morrison spurred his horse toward the big house. He needed to talk to Pettigrew, needed to tell him that whatever was building among the slaves was about to explode. But when he reached the house, he found Pettigrew already waiting on the front porch, his face pale as winter moonlight. "You feel it too, don't you?" Dutch asked. Pettigrew nodded slowly. "Something's coming. Something I don't think we're prepared for. It's that woman, that Ava. She's the center of whatever this is. Then maybe it's time to end it." "You mean?" "I mean maybe 300 marks is enough. Maybe it's time for a different kind of lesson." Dutch Morrison felt his stomach clench with fear. though he couldn't say exactly what he was afraid of. "Boss, I don't think killing her is going to solve our problem. I think it might make things worse." "How could it be worse than this? Look around, Dutch. The slaves ain't acting right. They're moving like they got a plan, like they're waiting for something." "Maybe so. But that woman, there's something about her that ain't natural, something that makes me think she might be more dangerous dead than alive." Pettigrew was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the slave quarters where cooking fires were being lit and the evening meal was being prepared. From this distance, it all looked peaceful, normal, the way it had looked every evening for the past 20 years. But underneath that normalcy, both men could sense something else. A current of energy, of purpose, of barely contained power that was building towards some kind of release. "Schedule the 300th marking for tomorrow morning," Pettigrew said finally, "in front of everybody, and have the men ready with guns. If anything happens, anything at all, we put it down hard and fast." That night in the quarters, Ava sat with her back against the cabin wall, her eyes closed, her lips moving in what looked like prayer but sounded like something older and more dangerous than any Christian hymn. The other slaves gave her space, sensing that she was communing with forces they couldn't see or understand, but they stayed close enough to watch, to witness, to be ready for whatever was about to unfold. "She's calling them," whispered Mama June to Uncle Simeon. "Calling who?" "The ancestors, the spirits of all the ones who died on the ships, in the fields, under the whip. She's calling them to come witness what happens tomorrow." Uncle Simeon felt his blood turn cold. "And you think they gonna answer?" Mama June looked at Ava, whose scarred face was glowing in the firelight like it was carved from some precious metal. "Child, I think they've been waiting for somebody to call them for a long, long time." Outside the cabin, the night air was filled with sounds that didn't belong to any earthly creature. Whispers in languages that had been silenced centuries ago. Footsteps that left no tracks. The rustle of clothing made from wind and memory. The dead were gathering at Hollow Creek Plantation. The dead were coming to watch their daughter take her 300th mark, and to see what would happen when the pain finally transformed into something else. Something that would make the earth tremble, and the foundations of slavery crack like eggshells. In the big house, Pettigrew lay awake listening to sounds he couldn't identify, feeling afraid of something he couldn't name, and wondering if maybe, just maybe, he should have left well enough alone. But it was too late for that now. 300 marks had been promised. 300 marks would be delivered. And whatever came after that, well, that was in the hands of forces bigger than any plantation owner, any overseer, any mortal man who thought he could own another human soul. The reckoning was 1 mark away. Sufferin' so bad, Lord have mercy. But when they called Ava to that branding ground for the 300th time, even the devil himself would have stepped aside to watch what was about to unfold. The morning broke gray and heavy, with mist rising from the creek, like the breath of ghosts. Every slave on Hollow Creek Plantation had been ordered to the disciplinary ground, not just to work, but to witness. Pettigrew wanted them all to see what happened to those who forgot their place. But as the slaves gathered in a circle around the branding station, something was different from all the times before. They weren't looking down at the ground or cowering in fear. They were standing straight, looking directly at Ava, and their faces were carved with something that looked like reverence. Dutch Morrison felt his hands shaking as he built up the fire in the forge. The tools kept slipping from his grip, and twice he had to restart the flames because they kept going out for no reason he could understand. "Hurry up with that fire," Pettigrew commanded from where he sat on his horse, surrounded by 3 other overseers with rifles ready. "Fire don't want to stay lit, boss," Dutch replied, his voice tight with nerves. "Then make it stay lit. We got business to finish." But even as Dutch Morrison worked to get the flames going, he could feel something pressing in around them. The air itself seemed thick, heavy with presence like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. The horses were dancing nervously, tossing their heads and rolling their eyes white with fear. Ava walked into the center of the circle with her head held high, moving like she was walking to her coronation instead of her punishment. She wore a simple slave dress, but somehow it looked like royal robes on her scarred frame. When she knelt by the forge, she looked directly at Pettigrew for the first time in months. "Morning, massa," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Beautiful day for a marking, don't you think?" Pettigrew felt something cold crawl up his spine. There was no fear in her voice, no submission. If anything, she sounded amused. "You got something funny about this situation?" he demanded. "Just thinking about numbers, massa. About how 300 is a powerful number. In the Bible, it says Gideon defeated the Midianites with just 300 men. David killed Goliath with one smooth stone. Sometimes it only takes a little thing to bring down something big." The slaves around the circle were listening to every word, and Pettigrew could see something passing between them. A look, a recognition, like Ava was speaking in code, and they all understood the message. "Get that fork hot," he ordered Dutch Morrison. "Hot as you can make it." Dutch Morrison pulled the branding fork from the flames, and for a moment it seemed to glow with more than just heat. It pulsed with light, like it was alive, like it was feeding on something more than coal and fire. "Hold her down," Pettigrew commanded. But when two field hands stepped forward to grab Ava's arms, she held up her hand. "Won't be necessary," she said. "I'll take this mark the same way I took all the others. By choice." "Ain't no choice about it," Dutch Morrison snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "There's always a choice," Ava replied. "You can give pain, or you can take it. You can use suffering to break somebody down, or you can use it to build yourself up. Every mark you put on me, you've been teaching me that lesson." She positioned herself over the branding station, her arm extended, her face calm as deep water. "Where you want this one, massa? Got a few spots left on my arms. Or maybe you ready to start on my face?" Pettigrew's mouth went dry, the way she was talking, like she was in control of the situation instead of him, like she was the one making the choices. "Put it on her shoulder," he said. "Make it deep." Dutch Morrison raised the glowing fork, but just as he was about to bring it down, Ava began to speak. Not singing this time, speaking in a voice that carried across the plantation like the voice of prophecy itself. "I call on the spirits of the Middle Passage," she said. "I call on the souls of the children sold away from their mothers. I call on the ghosts of the men who died under the whip, the women who died in childbirth producing masses prophets, the elders who died with freedom songs still frozen on their lips." The fork touched her skin, and the pain was like lightning striking flesh. But instead of screaming, Ava kept talking. "I call on Harriet and Sojourner and all the women who ran toward freedom with dogs baying at their heels. I call on Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey, and all the men who chose to die fighting rather than live kneeling." The smell of burning flesh filled the air, but the slaves in the circle weren't looking away. They were leaning forward, hanging on every word. "I call on my mama who died in the belly of a slave ship but gave me this charm to remember who I am." Ava pulled the bone carving from her dress, holding it up so everyone could see. "I call on my daddy, who I never knew but whose blood runs in my veins. I call on all my ancestors who are watching this moment and waiting to see what I'm going to do with all this pain they gave me the strength to carry." The branding fork was still pressed against her skin, but Dutch Morrison seemed frozen, unable to move it or pull it away. His face was gray with terror, like he was seeing something the rest of them couldn't see. "What's happening?" Pettigrew demanded. "Finish the job." But Dutch Morrison couldn't finish the job, because as Ava spoke, calling on the dead to witness her 300th marking, something was answering her call. The air around the branding station began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Shadows moved at the edges of vision. The smell of salt water and shipwood drifted across the plantation, as if the ocean itself was drawing near. And in the faces of the slaves gathered around the circle, something was changing. The fear was draining away, replaced by something else. Something that looked like recognition, like remembering, like waking up. "I take this 300th mark," Ava said, her voice rising above the sound of wind that seemed to be blowing from all directions at once. "Not as a slave taking punishment, but as a daughter of Africa claiming her inheritance. She reached up and grabbed Dutch Morrison's wrist, holding the branding fork against her own skin with a grip like iron. I take this mark as a promise that the pain stops here, that the breaking stops here, that the forgetting stops here. Her eyes found Pettigrew's, and when she spoke next, her voice was no longer her own. It was the voice of every woman who'd ever been sold on an auction block, every mother who'd ever had a child torn from her arms, every daughter who'd ever died dreaming of home. "And I promise you, Massa," she said, "that when I take my 400th mark, this plantation is going to remember what it was like before you built it on the bones of stolen people." The wind rose to a howl, and the slaves around the circle began to sway in rhythm, their voices joining together in a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Pettigrew tried to speak, tried to shout orders, tried to regain control of a situation that was spinning away from him faster than water through his fingers. But his voice was lost in the rising chorus of the living and the dead, all singing together for the first time in 300 years of silence. The 300th mark was burning into Ava's flesh, but she wasn't taking it as a victim anymore. She was taking it as a warrior preparing for her final battle, and everyone watching knew that when the 400th mark came, the whole world would burn. Sweet Jesus wept when old man Pettigrew decided that mark number 400 would be burned right into Ava's face. He sealed his own fate with fire and brimstone. The man had lost all sense, all reason, all understanding of what he was fixing to unleash upon his own cursed ground. The decision came 3 days after the 300th marking, when Pettigrew woke up from nightmares that left him screaming like a child. Every night since that day, he'd been seeing things that couldn't be there. Shadows moving in his bedroom, voices whispering in languages that predated Christ himself, and always, always, the sound of chains breaking somewhere in the darkness. His wife had taken to her bed with laudanum and terror, claiming that the very walls of the big house were weeping blood. His overseers were drinking themselves senseless, jumping at shadows, finding excuses to avoid the slave quarters after sunset. "It's got to end," Pettigrew told Dutch Morrison as they stood on the front porch of the big house, watching smoke rise from the morning cooking fires in the quarters. "That woman has poisoned the very air of this plantation." "Maybe we should sell her," Dutch suggested, his voice cracking like a young boy's. "Get her off the property before—" "Before what? Before she completes whatever devil's work she's been building toward?" Pettigrew's laugh was bitter as wormwood. "No, Dutch. We finish what we started, but this time we finish it permanent-like. The plan was simple and terrible. The 400th mark would be applied to Ava's face, destroying her beauty, marking her as permanently disfigured, breaking the almost mystical hold she seemed to have over the other slaves. They would heat the branding fork until it glowed white-hot as the sun itself, and they would press it deep into the soft skin of her cheek, creating a scar that would remind every slave on the plantation what happened to those who forgot their place. "And after?" Dutch asked. "After that, we sell what's left of her, send her so far away that even her ghost can't find its way back here." But as they made their plans on the big house porch, neither man noticed the small figure crouched beneath the floorboards. Little Moses, now 9 years old and wise beyond his years, had been sent by Mama June to listen at the walls of the big house, to bring back word of whatever evil was being plotted against their Ava. When Moses scurried back to the quarters with news of the plan, the reaction was swift and silent as death itself. The slave community had been preparing for this moment for months, gathering strength, making ready, waiting for the sign that would tell them the time for waiting was over. That sign was about to be given. "They planning to mark her face," Moses whispered to the circle of adults gathered around Mama June's fire, "and then sell her away." The silence that followed was deeper than the bottom of the ocean, heavier than chains, more terrible than the sound of the whip cutting air. "Well then," said Uncle Simeon finally, his voice steady as bedrock, "I reckon it's time." "Time for what?" asked Sarah. "Time for Ava to take her inheritance." Nobody asked what he meant. They all knew. For months now, Ava had been preparing them, teaching them, showing them how to transform pain into power, how to turn suffering into strength. She'd been forging them in the fires of resistance, one story at a time, one song at a time, one shared moment of defiance at a time. Now the moment had come for all that preparation to bear fruit. That evening, as the plantation settled into its usual routine of exhausted sleep and fearful dreams, something different was happening in the slave quarters. Instead of the normal quiet murmur of evening conversations, there was a deeper silence, the kind that comes before a storm breaks. Ava sat in the center of the largest cabin, surrounded by every slave who could fit inside. Children pressed close to adults, old ones leaned against young ones, and everybody listened as she spoke in a voice that seemed to come from some place deeper than her throat. "Tomorrow they gonna try to mark my face," she said simply. "They gonna try to break what they can't understand, destroy what they can't control. And what we gonna do about it?" asked a young man named Samuel, his fists clenched tight with rage. Ava smiled, and in that smile was the accumulated wisdom of every ancestor who'd ever refused to bow, every spirit who'd ever chosen death over dishonor, every soul who'd ever looked into the face of oppression and laughed. "We gonna let them try," she said. "And then we gonna show them what happens when you play with fire for too long." She reached into her dress and pulled out the bone charm her mother had given her all those years ago on the slave ship. The flickering firelight, it seemed to glow with its own inner radiance, as if it was carrying the concentrated essence of every prayer ever spoken by enslaved lips. "This here belonged to my mama, and her mama before her, and her mama's mama going all the way back to the motherland," Ava said, holding the charm up so everyone could see. "It carries the memory of who we were before the ships came, before the chains came, before they tried to make us forget our names." She pressed the charm to her lips, and when she spoke again, her words carried the weight of prophecy. "Tomorrow, when that branding fork comes toward my face, I'm gonna remember who I really am. I'm gonna remember that I'm the daughter of kings and queens, the child of warriors and griots, the inheritor of power older than slavery, stronger than chains, and more enduring than any plantation built on stolen land." The cabin was so quiet you could hear hearts beating, could hear the very air holding its breath. "And when I remember who I am," Ava continued, "I'm gonna help them remember something too. I'm gonna help them remember what it feels like to be afraid, what it feels like to have your power taken away, what it feels like to burn." Outside the cabin, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the first rumbles of thunder were rolling across the Georgia sky, like the voices of ancestors calling down judgment from heaven itself. Tomorrow would be the day of the 400th mark. Tomorrow would be the day everything changed. Tomorrow would be the day Ava stopped being property and became justice wearing flesh. Lord, have mercy on my soul. But when that morning dawned and the silence fell over Hollow Creek Plantation like a burial shroud, even the birds stopped singing in the trees. The very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something that would shake the foundations of the earth itself. Ava woke before dawn, but she hadn't been sleeping anyway. For the past 3 nights, she'd been visited by dreams that felt more real than waking life. Dreams where she walked through fields of white cotton that transformed into clouds, where she spoke with women whose faces she'd never seen but whose voices she'd always known, where she stood before a great fire that burned without consuming, that gave light without heat, that promised justice without mercy. In the last dream, her mother had come to her, not as the dying woman on the slave ship, but as the free woman she'd been in Africa, dressed in robes that shimmered like starlight, wearing gold that caught the fire of 1,000 suns. "Daughter," her mother had said, "the time has come to break the final chain." "What chain, Mama?" "The chain that makes them think they can own what belongs to the ancestors. The chain that makes them believe they can mark the children of lightning without calling down the storm." Now, as Ava walked to the creek for what she knew would be the last time, she carried that dream with her like a sacred trust. The water was cold and clear, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror, and when she knelt beside it, she could see not just her own face, but the faces of all the women who had come before her. "I'm ready," she whispered to the flowing water. "I'm ready to remember who I am." By the time the morning bell rang, calling the slaves to their daily labor, word had somehow spread through every cabin in the quarters. Today was the day. Today was when Ava would take her final mark. Today was when everything would change. But the slaves didn't go to the fields that morning. Instead, they moved slowly, deliberately, toward the disciplinary ground, forming a circle that was wider and deeper than any that had gathered before. Old ones who could barely walk came anyway, leaning on walking sticks and strong shoulders. Children who should have been working in the big house appeared from nowhere, slipping through gaps in the circle like ghosts. Dutch Morrison was already at the forge, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the branding fork. 3 times he'd tried to get the fire hot enough, and 3 times it had died down to embers for no reason he could understand. "Fire ain't taking," he called out to Pettigrew, who sat on his horse surrounded by 6 armed overseers instead of the usual 3. "It's like the wood don't want to burn." "Make it burn," Pettigrew shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "Use lamp oil if you have to." But even when Dutch Morrison doused the wood with oil and struck spark after spark, the flames wouldn't catch properly. They'd flicker and dance for a moment, then settle back into sullen coals that gave heat without light, warmth without the blazing intensity needed to make a proper branding iron. "Boss," one of the overseers said nervously, "maybe we should postpone this. Try again tomorrow when conditions are better." "No." Pettigrew's face was red with rage and something deeper than rage. Fear that had been building for months, terror that had been eating at his sleep, horror at the thing he'd created by marking Ava again and again and again. "We do this today. We do this now." Ava walked into the center of the circle, and as she moved, something extraordinary happened. The slaves around the perimeter began to hum, not the broken, mournful sounds they usually made, but something else entirely. Something that sounded like power learning how to sing. The humming grew deeper, richer, more complex, as voices joined in harmony that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was the sound of all the work songs that had ever been sung in cotton fields, all the spirituals that had ever been whispered in slave quarters, all the lullabies that had ever been hummed over children who might be sold away tomorrow. But underneath all of that was something older, something that predated slavery, that predated America, that came from a time when African voices had sung freely under African skies. "Make them stop that noise," Pettigrew commanded. But the overseers, hardened men who'd broken spirits and crushed rebellions, found themselves unable to move. The sound was hypnotic, overwhelming, like trying to stop the ocean from singing or the wind from whispering secrets. Ava knelt by the forge, and when she looked up at Pettigrew, her eyes were no longer the eyes of a slave woman who'd been marked 399 times. They were the eyes of every ancestor who'd ever refused to bow, every spirit who'd ever chosen death over submission, every force of nature that had ever been called down to witness injustice. "You ready for this, Massa?" she asked, and her voice carried across the plantation like thunder rolling across the sky. Pettigrew tried to speak, tried to give the order that would end this nightmare once and for all, but the words stuck in his throat like burning coal. Because as he looked down at Ava, surrounded by the circle of humming slaves, with storm clouds gathering overhead, and the very air crackling with electricity, he finally understood what he'd been doing all these years. He hadn't been breaking a rebellious slave. He'd been forging a weapon of divine retribution. And now that weapon was about to be turned against him. Dutch Morrison finally got the fire hot enough, pulling the branding fork from flames that suddenly blazed white-hot as the surface of the sun. The iron glowed like a fallen star, pulsing with heat that made the air shimmer. "Do it," Pettigrew whispered, his voice barely audible above the rising chorus of voices. "Finish it." But as Dutch Morrison raised the fork, aiming for the soft skin of Ava's cheek, she began to speak. Not in English this time. Not in any language the white men could understand. She spoke in the tongue of her mothers, words that had been carried across the Atlantic in the holds of slave ships, preserved in the secret chambers of broken hearts, passed down through generations of women who refused to let their true names be forgotten. And as she spoke, the storm clouds overhead began to swirl, and the first drops of rain began to fall. But this wasn't ordinary rain. This was the rain that washes away sins, the rain that cleanses injustice, the rain that falls when heaven itself decides that enough is enough. The final mark was coming, but it wouldn't fall on the face of a slave. It would fall on the hands of judgment itself, suffering so bad. But when that white-hot branding fork came down toward Ava's face and she moved like lightning itself, grabbing Dutch Morrison's wrist with hands that seemed to carry the strength of every ancestor who'd ever died in chains, the whole world held its breath to see what justice looked like when it finally came calling. Time slowed down like honey dripping from a broken comb. Dutch Morrison's eyes went wide with terror as he felt Ava's grip on his wrist. Not the grip of a slave woman who'd been beaten into submission, but the grip of something that had been forged in fire and tempered by pain until it was harder than any metal ever pulled from the earth. "What?" Dutch started to say, but the words died in his throat as he looked into Ava's eyes. They were glowing, not reflecting light, not catching the fire from the forge, but actually glowing from within, like there was lightning trapped behind her pupils, like there was molten gold flowing in her veins. "My turn," she said, and her voice was no longer just her own. It was the voice of every woman who'd ever been sold on an auction block, every mother who'd ever had children torn from her arms, every daughter who'd ever died with freedom songs frozen on her lips. With movement so fast it seemed impossible, Ava twisted Dutch Morrison's wrist, turning the branding fork away from her face and toward his. The man screamed, but his scream was lost in the rising chorus of slave voices that had reached a crescendo that made the very air vibrate. "Boss!" one of the overseers shouted, raising his rifle. "She's got Morrison!" But before any of them could fire, something extraordinary happened. The slaves around the circle, every man, woman, and child, stepped forward as one. Not running, not charging, just stepping forward with faces that showed no fear, no hesitation, no doubt about what they were willing to do. Uncle Simeon, who'd never raised his voice above a whisper in 20 years of slavery, spoke with the authority of an ancient king. "Any man points a gun at our Ava dies where he stands." The overseers looked at their rifles, then at the circle of slaves who suddenly seemed less like property and more like an army that had been waiting for the right moment to remember how to fight. "Shoot them!" Pettigrew screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the storm that was breaking overhead. Rain began falling harder, and with each drop the slaves seemed to grow taller, stronger, more dangerous. Dutch Morrison was on his knees now, the branding fork still in his hand but turned toward his own face by Ava's iron grip. He tried to let go of the iron, but his fingers wouldn't obey him. It was as if the metal had fused itself to his palm, as if the fire that had burned 400 slaves was now demanding payment in kind. "Please," Dutch whimpered, tears streaming down his face. "I was just following orders. I was just doing what I was told." Ava's grip tightened, and the fork moved closer to Dutch's cheek. "How many times you think folks begged you for mercy? How many times you think they said please while you burned their skin?" "I don't know. I don't remember." "Well, I remember. I remember every mark you put on me, every scar you carved into my flesh, every time you heated this fork and used it like it was your right to mark another human being like cattle." The fork was inches from Dutch Morrison's face now, the heat from it making his skin redden and blister. Around them, the circle of slaves was chanting something in languages that predated English, predated slavery, predated the very concept that one human being could own another. "Ava," Pettigrew called out, his voice desperate now. "Let him go, and I'll make you a deal. I'll give you your freedom, your papers, a wagon and supplies to get north." Ava turned her glowing eyes toward the man who'd ordered her marked 400 times, and when she smiled, it was like watching the sun rise over a battlefield. "Freedom?" she said, and her laugh was like wind through burning cotton. "Massa, don't you understand yet? I've been free all along, free in my mind, free in my spirit, free in my soul. You've just been too ignorant to see it. Then what do you want?" Ava looked at the branding fork in Dutch Morrison's trembling hand. then at the faces of all the slaves who'd gathered to witness this moment, then up at the storm clouds that were swirling overhead, like the very heavens were preparing to unleash judgment. "I want you to remember," she said. "I want you to remember that every mark you put on me was really a mark you put on your own soul. Every scar you carved into my flesh was really carving away your own humanity. Every time you burned me, you were really burning yourself." She pressed the fork closer to Dutch Morrison's face, and the smell of singeing skin filled the air. "And I want you to know," she continued, "that this pain you're about to feel, it's just the beginning. Because every slave you ever marked, every child you ever sold, every woman you ever whipped, they all gonna be waiting for you on the other side. And they gonna have all the time in the world to return every hurt you ever gave them." The fork touched Dutch Morrison's cheek, and his scream was like the sound of hell itself opening up to claim what belonged to it. But that scream was nothing compared to the sound that came next. Because as the 400th mark burned into flesh, not Ava's flesh, but the flesh of the man who'd been marking her, something fundamental shifted in the balance of power at Hollow Creek Plantation. The slaves stopped being slaves. The masters stopped being masters. And justice, which had been sleeping for 400 years of bondage, finally opened its eyes and began to stretch its terrible, beautiful wings. Ava stood up, releasing Dutch Morrison's wrist, letting him fall to the ground, clutching his burned face and whimpering like a child. Around her, the circle of former slaves was moving closer, their faces lit by lightning and rain, and the fire of freedom finally set loose. "Now," she said, her voice carrying across the plantation like the voice of prophecy itself, "let's talk about reparations." And somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the Georgia sky like the sound of chains breaking, like the sound of justice coming home, like the sound of 400 years of unpaid debts finally coming due. Sweet Jesus wept when Ava drove that white-hot branding fork deep into Dutch Morrison's eyes. The sound that came from his throat wasn't human no more. It was the sound of every cruelty he'd ever committed coming home to roost. Every mark he'd burned into innocent flesh, finally finding its way back to the hands that had wielded the iron. The fork went in clean, like it was meant to be there. Like justice had been waiting 400 marks for this exact moment. Dutch Morrison's screams echoed across Hollow Creek Plantation, sending birds flying from trees and making dogs howl in the distance. But Ava held firm, her hands steady as bedrock, her face calm as deep water. "This is for every child you marked," she said, pressing the iron deeper. "Every woman you branded, every man you broke with this same piece of metal." The overseers raised their rifles, but before they could fire, the slaves moved, not like a mob, but like an army that had been drilling for this moment their entire lives. Uncle Simeon tackled the nearest overseer, taking his rifle in one smooth motion. Sarah and Ruth surrounded another, their hands moving like lightning to disarm him. Even the children joined in, swarming over the remaining men like ants covering a fallen piece of fruit. Pettigrew tried to wheel his horse around, tried to flee back to the safety of the big house, but Mama June stepped into his path. The old woman looked up at the man who'd owned her for 30 years, and when she smiled, it was like watching death learn how to grin. "Where you going, massa?" she asked. "Party's just getting started." The horse reared, throwing Pettigrew to the ground. He hit hard, his leg twisting under him with a sound like dry wood snapping. When he tried to crawl away, he found himself surrounded by a circle of faces he'd never bothered to really see before. The faces of people he'd owned, people he'd marked, people he'd sold away from their families like livestock. "Please," he whimpered, blood running from his nose where he'd hit the ground. "I can make this right. I can free all of you, I can—" "You can't do nothing," said Uncle Simeon, pointing the captured rifle at Pettigrew's chest. "You had your chance to do right. 400 chances. You chose wrong every time." Meanwhile, Dutch Morrison had stopped screaming. The fork was buried so deep in his eye socket that only the handle was visible, and his body had gone limp as a rag doll. Ava stood over him, rain washing the blood from her hands, her face illuminated by lightning that seemed to come not from the sky, but from somewhere inside her own soul. "Is he dead?" asked little Moses, his voice filled with wonder rather than fear. Ava knelt and pressed her ear to Dutch Morrison's chest. For a moment there was silence, then she shook her head. "Not yet," she said, "but he's learning what it feels like to live with permanent marks. Learning what it feels like to be branded by pain that won't ever heal." She stood up, pulling the fork from Dutch Morrison's ruined face. The metal was still hot, still glowing with more than just reflected firelight. She held it up so everyone could see. "This tool has marked its last slave," she announced. "From now on, it belongs to justice." Thunder crashed overhead, and the rain came down harder, washing Dutch Morrison's blood into the Georgia earth where it mixed with the soil that had been watered by slave tears for generations. The plantation would never be the same. The world would never be the same. And somewhere in the distance you could hear the sound of chains breaking, of freedom bells ringing, of justice finally learning how to sing. Lord, have mercy. But when Ava's body finally gave way under the weight of 400 marks and a lifetime of pain, she didn't fall like a victim falls. She fell like a warrior falls, on her own terms, with victory blazing in her eyes and freedom burning in her heart. The moment came as the storm reached its peak, with lightning splitting the sky and thunder shaking the very foundations of the big house. Ava had been standing over Dutch Morrison's unconscious form, the bloody branding fork still in her hand, when suddenly her knees buckled. But even as she fell, she was smiling. "Ava!" cried Mama June, rushing to catch her before she hit the ground. "Child, stay with us!" The other slaves gathered around, forming a protective circle as Ava struggled to speak. Her voice was weak now, but it still carried the authority of someone who had looked death in the face and found it wanting. "Listen to me," she whispered, her hand reaching for the bone charm around her neck. "This ain't the end, this is just the beginning." "Don't talk like that," said Uncle Simeon, his voice thick with grief. "You gonna be fine. You gonna live to see freedom come to this whole country?" Ava shook her head, blood flecking her lips as she spoke. "My freedom was never about living to see tomorrow. My freedom was about making sure y'all remembered who you really are." She pressed the bone charm into little Moses's hand, her fingers closing around his with surprising strength. "This belonged to my mama, and her mama before her. Now it belongs to you, all of you. Keep it safe. Keep the memory alive." The rain was washing over them all, but nobody moved to seek shelter. This was sacred ground now, consecrated by blood and sacrifice and the kind of courage that changes the course of history. "What we gonna do now?" asked Sarah, tears mixing with rainwater on her face. "Where we gonna go?" Ava's eyes found each face in turn, memorizing them, blessing them with her gaze. "You gonna be free," she said simply. "Really free. Not just running away, not just hiding, but walking proud with your heads held high. You gonna teach your children who they really are. You're gonna remember that you come from kings and queens, from warriors and griots, from people who built pyramids and sailed oceans and created wonders that the whole world still admires." Her voice was getting weaker, but her spirit seemed to be growing stronger. "And when they ask you how freedom came to Hollow Creek Plantation, you tell them it came through fire. You tell them it came through pain transformed into power. You tell them it came through a woman who refused to let 400 marks break her spirit." Pettigrew, still lying on the ground with his broken leg, tried to speak. "You're all still my property. The law." "The law?" Ava turned her fading eyes toward him, and even dying, she was more powerful than he would ever be. "Massa, you still don't understand. There ain't no law higher than the law that says human beings can't own other human beings. And that law just got written in blood on this plantation." She coughed and more blood came up, but she kept talking. "Y'all take whatever you can carry from that big house. Take the silver, take the gold, take anything you can use to start your new lives. That's not stealing, that's collecting wages for years of unpaid labor." Uncle Simeon nodded grimly. "We gonna honor your memory, Ava. We gonna make sure your story gets told." "Don't just tell my story," Ava whispered. "Live it. Every day you draw breath as free people, you living my story. Every child you raise up proud and strong, you living my story. Every time you look oppression in the face and refuse to bow down, you living my story. The thunder was moving away now, and the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the storm clouds. Ava saw the light and smiled one last time. "Look at that," she said. "Even the sky knows it's time for something new to begin." Her eyes closed, but her lips kept moving, whispering words in the old language, words that carried blessings and promises, and the kind of love that doesn't die when the body gives out. When she finally went still, the silence that followed was not the silence of ending. It was the silence of beginning, the silence of seeds being planted, the silence of revolution being born. Come close now, children, and let me tell you how the woman that fire couldn't destroy became the flame that lit the way to freedom for generations yet unborn. When word spread through the South about what happened at Hollow Creek Plantation, how a slave woman named Ava had marked her oppressor with his own branding iron, how an entire plantation had thrown off their chains in a single morning, how justice had finally come calling with fire in her hands, it was like lightning striking dry timber. The fire spread. Other plantations began reporting incidents. Slaves who'd never heard of Ava began refusing to work. Overseers started waking up to find their whips burned to ash, their branding irons buried in the ground like tombstones. The name Ava was whispered in slave quarters from Virginia to Louisiana, and with each telling the story grew stronger, more powerful, more dangerous to those who thought they could own human souls. The former slaves of Hollow Creek scattered to the four winds, carrying Ava's bone charm and her story with them. Moses grew up to be a preacher who could make grown men weep with his sermons about transformation and resistance. Mama June started a school for freed slaves, teaching them to read using stories about African queens and warrior women. Uncle Simeon became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping hundreds of people find their way to freedom. Each of them carried scars from their time in bondage. But like Ava had taught them, they turned those scars into maps. Maps that showed other people how to navigate from slavery to freedom, from despair to hope, from forgetting to remembering. The big house at Hollow Creek stood empty for years, its windows like dead eyes staring out over fields where cotton grew wild and untended. People said it was haunted, that on stormy nights you could see lights moving through the rooms, hear voices singing spirituals in languages that predated slavery. Maybe it was haunted. Maybe the spirits of all the people who died in chains had finally found a home where they could rest in peace, knowing that their suffering had not been in vain. Dutch Morrison lived, if you could call it, living. Blind and broken, he spent his remaining years telling anyone who would listen about the woman whose eyes had glowed like fire, whose hands had turned his own weapons against him, whose voice had called down heaven's judgment on a place built by hell's cruelty. Old Man Pettigrew died bankrupt and alone, his plantation sold to pay debts, his family scattered like leaves in a wind that carried the scent of burning cotton and the sound of breaking chains. But Ava became something more than memory. She became legend. She became hope. She became the promise that no matter how much pain they tried to inflict, no matter how many marks they burned into flesh, no matter how hard they worked to break the spirit, some things just couldn't be broken. Some souls were forged too strong. Some fires burned too bright. Some women carried too much lightning in their bones to ever be struck down by lesser powers. And now, sitting here by this dying fire, with rain pattering soft on the roof and wind whispering secrets through the trees, let me tell you the final truth about Ava of the Branding Fork. She never really died. She just transformed again, the way she'd been transforming all along, from captured child to marked woman to spiritual warrior to eternal flame. Every time someone stands up to injustice, she's there. Every time someone refuses to be broken by pain, she's there. Every time someone chooses freedom over safety, resistance over submission, truth over comfort, there's Ava living her story through their courage. 400 marks they put on her body. But those marks became 400 reasons why freedom could not be denied, why justice could not be postponed, why the arc of history, no matter how long, always bends toward what's right. The old ones say that suffering can make you smaller or it can make you larger. Ava chose larger, chose to let every mark expand her soul until it could hold not just her own pain, but the pain of all her people. And when that soul finally burst free from the flesh that could no longer contain it, it scattered like seeds on the wind, taking root wherever courage was needed, wherever hope was dying, wherever people needed to remember that they were more than their circumstances. That's how memory becomes legend. That's how pain becomes power. That's how one woman's refusal to be broken can break the chains that bind a nation. And that's how we know, even today, even now, that somewhere in the world, Ava is still marking oppressors with the fire they tried to use against the innocent, still teaching people to transform their scars into stories, their wounds into wisdom, their suffering into strength. Because some souls don't just survive their trials, they transcend them. And in transcending, they light the way for all the rest of us still learning how to be free. The body was marked, but the spirit soared. The flesh was scarred, but the soul stayed whole. And that memory we guard here, in the souls of slavery,